Hope you're having a fabulous day. Great start to the week. All right, so today I'm going to be addressing a question that came through from one of my students, and I think this is something that definitely I see people struggle with. So I'm going to give you some tips today on how to resolve it. So the question is, and I think we all, when we're designing our interactive stories, we all want to get really good at writing powerful questions, right? And also the kinds of questions where whoever is making the decision, our adult target audience, they're reading every single option, right? And they're learning from it, and they're making a really compelling decision, right? So you want to write things that are like really powerful and also meaningful, and none of those options are throwaway, like, you know, that they know immediately. They're like, yeah, I know that one's wrong because it's like the shortest one or the longest one, whatever, right? So I'm going to give you some tips today. Now, the other thing is, if you are somebody who's like overwhelmed with just getting started with interactive storytelling, or actually is really intrigued by it and is thinking, I want to learn way more than whatever little thing you're sharing during this live, Anna, go to elearningsecrets.com and register for my upcoming webinar. I know some people are waiting. It's coming. So just register so that you're abreast of the news as they develop. All right, so first off, let's just solidify a couple of things. And by the way, if you can't read this and it's coming through backwards, just let me know in the comments, okay? I'll make sure to adjust it, but usually things come through pretty fine. Okay, so the first thing I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with is about what is really an interactive story, and the piece that we're going to go into a little bit more deeply today, okay? So an interactive story really is a framework that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And here is a way that somebody is looking at the world, so which is the old perspective. We're going to call it the old P. And here we're going to have something which is the new perspective, or the new P. Yep. All right. Now, the old perspective and the new perspective, the way somebody gets to their new perspective is through, let me adjust that a little bit. Yeah, that is better. They get through to their new perspective through a bunch of decisions, a bunch of challenges they need to go through. So these are decisions. And each of these decisions I call pearl. So this is a string of pearls, and each of these pearls is actually a decision point. So what's really cool is that as your person, even in this linear model, as your learner is going through and making decisions, within each pearl, they make a choice on how things are going to work out. And then it makes them feel like they're in charge of that story and in charge of the outcome, okay? So let's just dig into what makes up this pearl a little bit, and then I can talk to you about how people sometimes mess up a little bit, or they add a little bit more verbiage to it, that it might be a little unnecessary, and where I borrow from to actually make this a better process for not just me but also the learner. So win-win, right? Because I think the goal with any of these things is that we actually not only create things that people enjoy going through, but the process that we go through, the creative process, is not painful. It's still work, but you look forward to it, right? You're like, I can do this, you know, I know that I'll get it. So that's what I want us to focus on. So let's just dig into the pearl for a little bit. By the way, if you're enjoying this content, I'd love for you to share it or give it a thumbs up, because that puts me on top of the other kitty videos and other stuff that's out there and helps spread the word. So if you do that, I would appreciate it. Or share it with somebody who you think will actually benefit from this, who struggles writing these questions or writes a lot of questions, especially scenario-based questions, for a living. That's not to say that this cannot be applied to other types of questions, even if you're doing assessments, right? Which is basically what we're doing here. Is what's a scenario question? It's a multiple choice question. Really, at its core, let's not kid about that. So, what is a pearl, right? Calling this a pearl. A pearl, basically it's this interactive story, like the meat of it, right, is really just three things. So we've got a setup for a question or a decision, like, and then options on how to solve it. More than three, actually, you should stay away from. If you have more than three options, I think you're going a little too complex. So you might want to split that up into two decisions, to be honest with you, because the more options you give somebody, the more paralysis you give them. So I fluctuate between 2 to 3 options. Alternate choice, which is what you have 2 options, can be actually very powerful, especially if you are in a context where people have to make decisions fairly quickly. That's a great space to use that. But for now, we're going to focus on, let's say you are writing scenario questions and you have about 3 really valid options. And then after you have an option and you choose that course of action on how to solve this problem, then you get a consequence. And consequences have nothing to do with feedback. Consequences are the result that happens. So the result is not good work. The result is not you did that well, you did that right, Judy was happy, is a consequence potentially of an action. Judy cried. Whatever happens, it has to be something you would be able to experience as the learner. So a consequence is just that. Feedback may be added after here, but it's not always necessary. If your consequence is compelling and you've structured it in the right way, there's no need for feedback. You let the person draw their own conclusions from the consequences, just like you would if you touched a hot iron, it burnt you. Nobody has to go up and say, that was a bad thing. No, it's, So that's what that is at the end. But what this person, one of my students actually said that they struggled with, and I've struggled with this myself, so I know, and the worst thing is when you're writing things that are so long that they no longer fit the constraints of your question, right? And that happens when your scenario is a little bit more complex, or if it's dialogue based and you can't, say it all in a tweet, and even a tweet sometimes too long. So here's what happens. She was struggling right here. She was saying not only were these really long for her, like the options is like do this, do this, do this, and then you could do this, but also that they all started sounding the same. And so what she was fearful of is that people would read like the first option and maybe the second, but not read through everything, or that this would just be too overwhelming for them. So here's a strategy that you can use that I didn't come up with. I borrowed it from video games. And what's cool is in this world that we live in today is that everything that we're struggling with in L&D is actually somebody else is already doing it outside of our work. And so all you have to do is go out there and say, hey, who's already doing that well? What are they doing? Okay, so for this, video games have already been doing this for a very, very long time. So what they do is, especially in games that are very dialogue heavy, where people will be like, okay, I gotta answer. I'm in a situation now, I have to figure out what to say. They're not gonna read through all the dialogue pieces, because then you lose kind of the semblance of what you're trying to do, right? You're like, what did that say again, right? So what you're trying to do then is really come down to the ethos, basically, of that option. So what you would do is, instead of having like, let's say your questions are, where option A is all these lines. Let's make this A, B, C, all these lines and all these lines. What you would do is then summarize them in a punchy either single sentence or single word. Sometimes it actually works when you do it in a single word, which is really powerful. So let's say instead of here, and games do this so good. So it's actually good to see other games, or basically practice doing this, right? Because you can distill these to an essence. So let's say And it's also very important to reinforce certain contexts for your learners. So let's say option A really is about, let's say we're talking about customer service off the top of my head. And the first, let's say the setup was, what do you do with this customer? How do you help this customer? And you could say, apologize. Maybe detract, like, focus on something else. Or you could say, let's say you could antagonize, right? Obviously, this is a made-up example. But one of the things you can do is very quickly put emphasis on the types of actions that are available that each one of these options kind of reinforces. And then what happens is, because you're focusing on the major themes, this could be a short sentence like apologize to customer, validate, but actually that would be a good one here. Validate, that's a good one. Validate, but don't apologize, right? So in customer service, you might be like, yes, that is a bad thing that happened, but we can't fix it. That's simply the way the rules are, things like that, whatever. So what's happening here is you're actually putting emphasis on the actual action, the ethos of this actual conversation, right? Which is cool, because if they click on apologize, you might still give them the option to read that before they do it. Or if your goal is to emphasize the kinds of thinking and the kinds of actions, not necessarily the specific way that they say it, but really what are we doing when something like this happens. I find that most people, let's say in my customer service calls, they apologize when they shouldn't be apologizing. They should actually just validate the customer and listen to them, but they shouldn't be apologizing as an empathize. So you could have empathize, sympathize, and validate, or whatever, right? So one of the things you're really doing here is you're thinking about your adult learner, finding out where they're behaviorally making the major errors, and then making sure that those are kind of represented in your major statements. And then what happens is when they click on, let's say, apologize in this case, what happens is they see it play out and see the consequence of apologizing to a customer. And people would do that differently, right? But then it just gives you a lot more freedom. Instead of trying to wordsmith everything here, you can actually very quickly draft up with your practitioners, how do people mess up? They apologize, or they get aggressive, or they do this. And then you have these three things, and you can say, okay, what does that sound like when somebody apologizes? Or what does that sound like when they're aggressive? And then what happens is you just have even a quicker framework for that, because you don't really have to go, you could even, if I clicked apologize, you might not even have to show what that person said. You might actually just go straight to the consequence of the customer going, well, aren't you going to apologize to me? Or thank you for apologizing. Obviously, this is a wrong thing. Now I want my refund, right? So you have options. You can make this as complicated as you want, but up front, you can make it very, very simple with these just powerful statements about the kinds of actions somebody takes, especially if you're not focused on the details, you're focused on the big picture. So, any questions or comments that you have, I would love to hear them. You want more of this kind of amazingness, and you want to get away from, being a slave to your subject matter expert and the PowerPoint slides, go to elearningsecrets.com, register for that webinar. Also, if this is something you enjoyed, please vote it up. That's awesome. I appreciate that. And have a wonderful rest of the day, my friends, and take care. Thanks so much for sticking by and listening. I really appreciate your time. Bye.